All right, welcome everyone. It's Sunday night, 8:30-ish, the Central Time. Thanks everyone for joining me. I hope everyone is doing well amidst all this crazy times. We're here with Terence Fugazzi from Neptune Systems. Terence, thanks for being with me on a Sunday night.
Absolutely.
And let's do an audio check. If everyone can hear both of us, go ahead and raise your hand so I know that we're not talking into the abyss of the internet.
I can hear you.
You can hear me. That's always. We'll just talk to each other, and people can watch us talk all night. It'll be like,
yeah,
like psychologists watching people be like, that's very interesting, very profound. Hands are going up slowly but surely. People are coming around. Simon from Canada can hear us. That's good. It's good to know the internet works in Canada. All right, let's jump in then, since everyone can hear us, and start talking about dosing and supplementing strategies for winning and avoiding disastrous pitfalls. Before I go into everything, the recording from last week's session, if you didn't get it, is out on the SaltwaterAquarium.com YouTube channel. We have a new playlist for this whole webinar series. So if you missed it, we talked about the strategy of saltwater fish selection. You can go catch it. Terence, that's a hell of a coffee mug. And not only that, it's like square. Sorry, I'm just like, look at that mug. It's like flat. That before, that's cool. Where did you get that?
A long time ago from a pottery person at like Christmas fair or something, but we've had them forever. I'm the only one that uses them because they weigh about 4 pounds a piece. And so nobody else in the house uses them because they're so darn heavy, but I just love them. We have 6 of them. Great.
Oh, well, if you need to club the zombies when they come, you can use that. That's fantastic. All right, so if you missed the recording, it's out on YouTube, but that was last week. Tonight is Sunday night. This week, it's April 5th. Let's jump into it and talk about dosing and supplementing, because I'm willing to bet, I'm hoping that you have a reef tank that is successful. It's getting to be successful, where you need to start dosing or supplementing your tank. And I'm going to use the term interchangeably tonight. Dosing is really two-part dosing, which you do with a dosing pump, but some of us run calcium reactors. So when I say dosing, know that I'm really talking about, in a way, supplementing your tank. So I use those terms interchangeably. If you're on the fence between dosing pumps and calcium reactors, you're in the right place. I'm going to talk to you about that tonight. Terence and I are going to go back and forth on this, so this will be fun. We'll have 2 different point of views. Terence does some things differently than I do. As you can see, he has a very beautiful reef tank behind him. Love the backdrop. I have a very ugly temporary reef tank behind me, but hey.
This is not a green screen. This is for real right now. And the hennies hang out because they want to eat. So they always want to eat. They're always hanging out right there.
They'll always eat. All right, so let's talk about this dosing thing. The thing about dosing and supplementing your tank is that it is a data-driven process. The data will tell you when to start dosing, how much to dose, and how you are doing. It is a compass and it's a scorecard. So this is something where I see a lot of people making a lot of mistakes. When they go to dosing, they just throw caution to the wind and they're like, okay, I'm just going to start dosing something. And in other words, it's just kind of like, okay, go. We're just going to go. Don't know why. We're just boom, time to go. And they say, I just started my tank and I'm dosing. I'm like, why are you dosing? Like, I don't know. I just heard that I was supposed to dose something. Or they woke up one day like, I guess I'm going to dose today. I'm like, why? You want to do it when your tank tells you to do it. This is good for
some
those
people
that are
just thinking about it like in week 2, right? I mean, it's like they just got their tank. They're in week 2 or 3, and they're like, I need to start dosing my 2-part, right? And they've got all the gear and everything. So, but no, you have to know you need to dose.
And that's a great point. And that's one thing about it is, look, some people like to get all their gear, set it all up, and at least have it, which is fine. And I talked about clients that when I'm building a tank, like, hey, if we're going to go the calcium reactor route or the dosing route, we'll talk about those. And I say, if you just want to get the gear there and have it ready to go, that's cool. We can do it. We likely won't need it for 6 months, maybe a year. But some people just like to get it all. I've had a client even tell me once, he said, I have to do it now because my wife will never know how much it actually costs. Hey, whatever works for you, nothing wrong with getting it, but you don't necessarily have to use it from the get-go. So, especially when it comes time to dose, once they start dosing, they just randomly throw stuff in their tank and they're like, okay, I dosed. I feel better about myself. Like, well, why did you dose that? And how much did you know you're supposed to dose? And what is it actually going to do for you? And they're like, I don't know, I'm dosing, I'm just supposed to start dosing. For example, I had a client once and they had someone service their tank. And every month he said, dump in these 2 bottles. And they asked him why. And it's like, I don't know, I just like to do it, dose these 2 bottles. So that's analogous to just kind of sitting there and just saying, just do it, just dose, which is doing it blindly. You're just randomly dosing stuff. And when you randomly do stuff in your saltwater tank, you end up with that. And yes, that's my bucket of dead skeletons. Now, some of you might bury that in your backyard because you don't want your spouse to see it because you didn't tell them exactly how much you really paid for that piece of coral or that.
We decorate our bathroom with them, Mark, just so you know. We've got my dead corals of yore all around the bathroom, so we don't have to go buy decorations. They just come out of my aquarium.
You can get them at Potty Barn. Trust me, there are times when I'm like, I might be able to get like $10 for that on eBay. And I'm like, no, then someone will pick up on that and that'll just be bad. Or you can bust it up and throw it in your calcium reactor. I've heard of people doing that. You can do that too, right? But when you just throw the caution to the wind, you just randomly do things with dosing your tank, you very likely going to end up as that. Especially some of these chemicals that you're dosing can nuke your tank. Now, when I first started getting into reef tanks, I fell into the habit that a lot of people do in the trap, and they walk into their local fish store and they have all these pretty bottles of things. And look, the marketing on this is really good. They got these pretty bottles with pretty corals, and you're like, I want that. I don't know why. I just see the label and I want that. And then I just dumped it in and it didn't go well. So when it comes to dosing, you need data. As I said, this is a data-driven process. So with data comes insights into your tank, when to start, how much do you dose, and you dial it all up and down based on data. Now, I'm going to talk to you about exactly how to do that throughout this evening. So, for example, if your alkalinity drops, that may mean that your corals are starting to take off. Is it your nitrates bump up? Maybe you lost a fish. Maybe it's time to start carbon dosing. All these things are going to be driven by your tank. I'm big on listening to your tank. Let your tank drive the day. If you're a control freak, if you're type A personality, that's okay, but let the tank do the driving and you can go from there.
And, you know, it might be a little scary to people see graphs like this. I am the kind of control freak, but really, I mean, if you're just starting out or what have you, and you don't have this kind of gear, just a notebook, just keep really good logs in your notebook from your manual testing and those kinds of things. And you can get the same kind of little data track that you see here, just do it manually.
Absolutely. I remember that. Nothing wrong with writing it down. The point is to write it. Now, to write anything down, you're going to have to test. The T word that a lot of reefers just don't like. They're like, oh, test? Like, you can tear down the tank, but don't make me test anything. So yes, you have to test. And mostly when we determine how much to dose, it depends on your test results and what you get. You're going to dose when your tank tells you to, and the only way you're going to know that is when you test and you get a test result. I'm sorry, but your tank is really in charge. It drives the day. Now,
you get a number of test results, which I'm sure Mark's going to talk about, right?
There's tons of test results. Now, if you hate testing, sorry, but you just have to do it. But there's some wiggle room, which I'm going to talk about later tonight. Now, if you hate it that bad, there's services that do it for you, or you can automate it. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But here's the thing. Whenever you test, whether you do it automatically or you do it by hand, if you want to put it in an app, you want to put it in Apex Fusion, if you have an Apex, or you just want to do it on a piece of paper, that's fine. But the point is, write it down because you're going to forget. And then when you forget or you don't back up your data for your techie types and you lose it all and you wake up one day and you go, it's gone, you're going to look like this. Here's the thing. You're not going to remember it. You think you're like, I remember that. You're not. Just, okay, you're not. You think you're going to remember. You're not. Okay. Just like your anniversary, make a reminder. You're probably forget. Whatever you want to do is you don't want to put off testing. Even if things are doing well in my tank, still, you test and spot positive trends so you know what happens if something goes wrong. This is a big mistake I see with a lot of people. Something starts going wrong with their tank, and then they're like, okay, I guess now I should test. So they get this one snapshot in time when things are bad, and it's like, okay, well, what does it look like when things are good? Well, I don't know. I don't have any reference. So you have no chance to see what's working for you because you don't have any data to fall back on. So it's important to test and to write it down. Now, if you don't want to do it, you hate it that bad, you can pay someone to do it. There are a couple of different companies who would do it for you. All these companies, you get the water sample, you send it off. In a couple of days, they send your results. And they also test for things that you can't with most test kits, We'll talk about that a little later. Now, those of you that
let's be frank here. Let's be frank here. If you are going to not be into doing testing, especially early on in the aquarium, where you have to do a lot more in the beginning to find out where different things are happening. But if that's not going to be your thing, these to me are mostly supplemental. If you're not into testing, get somebody to take care of your aquarium. You're not going to be taking care of your aquarium yourself. You have to be able to test. You have to be able to do these things, even if you don't like doing them. If you don't, it's just part of keeping a saltwater aquarium. It's part of, having a classic car. You're going to wax it, or somebody else is going to wax it for you. It's just these are the things of being in the hobby. So I don't think there's any way around. There is no substitute. For me, Mark, at least these particular things, they're just supplements to the manual testing that you just better get used to doing time to time.
Absolutely. I have my own manual tests. I send off these water tests once a month just as supplements, like Terence suggested. But at the bare minimum, I have my test kits. They're not expired because I use them. And it doesn't have to be something painful. Like testing your tank, and I'll show you what to test in a minute, shouldn't take you more than 15 minutes. And you can test right in front of your tank. You can enjoy it while you're doing it. It doesn't have to be a painful process. And yes, I think there is some level that if you're not willing to test your tank, pay someone to do it. If you're not willing to do that, this might not be the hobby for you. Now, you can automate things. There's different ways to do it. There's different automated testers out there. This is one that's very common in Europe. And then here in the United States, as well as worldwide, we have the Neptune Systems Trident, which I've been using for about 1.25 years now, which I've been very, very happy with. It's actually on this tank back here, running test 4 times a day. Why? Some people say, why are you running it back here? Because you don't have that much coral, but I do have some. And again, I want that baseline. I'm curious to see how this goes to my other one. And it's been fun to watch trends because the coral growth is happening in here. Besides seeing it, and also notice my alkalinity dropping. So I'm like, something is going on in the tank. And again, over time, whatever test results you use, if you send it off, you use the Trident, if you do it manually, you're gonna get a running log. This is the log of test results out of one of my old tanks. And you can see about every month I sent off water and got a reading. So now I have a log, I have a graph of what this looks like. And again, you can do this by hand. If you do your test results manually, write them down, and you can get this graph by hand. This isn't hard to create, but I have numbers. And it's very easy to see, okay, you know what? A lot of things are pretty dang stable in this tank. Not enough is moved, not a lot is moving around, and that's okay. It's not like you have to see peaks and valleys. If it's all flat, you have that data. Then if you fall off the cliff or you all of a sudden get on top of a mountain, you're like, now something's changed. Now you can get inquisitive about it. All right, so what do you test for? I've drilled into your mind that you should be testing. What do you actually go after? Well, there's tons of stuff that you can go after. All these different things that you hear you should test, you shouldn't test. What should you actually test for? What do I recommend? Here's what I start with as a baseline, is this: salinity, temperature, pH, calcium alkalinity, magnesium nitrates, and phosphates. Now, let me put a disclaimer on pH. On my apexes, which I have on all my systems, I have a pH probe on that apex. It comes with it. That's giving me a reading. pH, I'll talk about ranges in a bit. If I didn't have an apex, would I still check pH? Maybe once a week, probably not.
One of the key things, if somebody is going to do that, if you didn't have, say, an apex or an automated pH meter, one of the key things to do, because there are situations where people might have a lot of extra CO2 in their home or something, and they want to kind of get a baseline on that. They don't have a controller, don't really understand why they wouldn't be monitoring, but if they aren't, if you're going to do that pH test, do it the exact same time of the day when you're checking from one day to the next or from 1 week to the next or what have you, because of the fluctuation of pH during the day. If you do manually test that with a test kit, you have to test it at the same time, or it doesn't really give you anything.
Great point. Great point. So there's also, if you don't want a controller, there are pH tester pins that you can get. I have one of those in my acclimation kits for tanks, for fish and corals. There's all different ways to do it. So what test kits do I recommend? If you go to mrsaltwatertank.com/test kits, I have my recommended list. I'm not going to go through that tonight, but if you're curious on what I use on my tanks and my clients' tanks, it's right there on that list for you. Okay, so I said, remember, testing is about data. And when we have data, we can avoid this. Like your tank is not a risk taker. It doesn't like these peaks and valleys. It's like a grumpy old man who doesn't want to change. And if he is going to change, he wants to change really slowly. Don't push him into do something wild. You have to do little incremental changes. In other words, your tank likes this. This is the most boring roller coaster ride ever. Not very exciting. It might be exciting for your young kids, but not so much for you or your tank. So it's okay if things are flat. This is more of what you want when it comes to dosing. All right. What do I dose?
Hang on one sec. So sometimes people want to get kind of the reasoning for that. One of the key reasons for this is, the ocean does change up and down as well, but it's often kind of calmly cyclical. It's not crazy, right? And so what happens is if your tank is changing plus or minus 2 degrees all the time, all over the place, or the pH is changing all over the place, the animals inside are adapting to that new environment or that new change. It doesn't mean it's going to necessarily kill them, but what it does is that it takes some of their energy, so to speak. And whether it's corals or fish or what have you, it can make animals more susceptible to disease. It can make the corals not grow as fast. It can all of these things because they are adapting to those rapid changes or those out of pattern changes. So that's one of the reasons why, it's not that you have to maintain an exact, for instance, temperature, okay? But if your temperature is going to fluctuate, it's nice if it's plus or minus a half or 1 degree and it's kind of going up and down slowly rather than all over the place. So that's kind of the reasoning behind it.
Great. All right. So what do you dose in your tank? It's very easy for me. I dose what I can test for. Mostly. There's some wiggle room. We'll get to that later this evening. So when you're first starting out, for those of you that remember the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. Like this is paint by numbers. Just do this, do that. You might not know why, but wax on, wax off. Start with the basics. These are the things that you want to be testing for when it comes to getting the idea about dosing. Calcium, magnesium, and alkalinity, the big three. Start with these. It doesn't have to be hard. Keep it very simple. As your skills grow, then you can get into more trendy type elements, things that look cool. Terence, if you could pull that mustache off for a magnet at some point, that would be awesome.
I don't know, but actually my creative designer that does all the Apex stuff, he actually has a mustache not far off from that.
That's impressive. A lot of work.
Yeah,
all right.
So something funny, see him in China. Okay, all the people looking at him in China, it's great.
Yeah, I haven't been there.
Well, no, when you look a little outside of the normal, everybody in China turns. If you happen to be like tall like you, or you have the handlebar mustache or whatever, it's like you can stop traffic in China. It's funny.
All right, so once you get the hang of this, different things that you can start testing for potentially dosing: iron, manganese, potassium, bromide. I always laugh about that one. Bromide. The thing about this is for a lot of these, the test kits really aren't that great. So this would be a time when you want to start using a testing service. A lot of these can also give you results on things that you can't test for. For example, heavy metals. Not that you want to be dosing heavy metals, but if you have those in your tank's water, you want to know that. There's no real way to test for it, but these water services can tell you that. So as I said earlier, I manually test my tank, automatically test my tank, and I still send off the water to these water services. All right, so now that we have our data, you can dose, right? Well, here's the thing. You don't necessarily have to go straight to dosing because water changes are going to take care of things for a while. This works when you don't have a lot of corals and they're not very big. So look, when you first start your tank, you probably don't have any corals in there. Or if you do, hopefully you don't just go and get some big colonies and put them in your tank because they're likely not going to be happy. Start with frags, and then as things start to grow, they're going to take up some elements, alkalinity, calcium, and things like that. Those levels are going to dip. You can do a water change and bring them back up. Because there's not a very big coral, there's not a lot of them, they're not taking up that much of it. So a water change will get the job done. So you can start dosing per se by simply doing a water change.
What will take it down though, Mark, is the coral and algae. So if especially if you have a more of a mixed type reef tank with maybe not quite as bright a light, your coral and algae will start to grow fairly fast in a tank, depending on how it's seeded also. But once that coral and algae takes off, it's amazing how much just the coral and algae will take out of the water, even without many corals in there, because of the amount of surface area on all the rock and the walls and the back and everything.
Absolutely. And the only way you're going to know that it's taking off, other than you see it, is you're going to start seeing it in your test results.
Absolutely.
I said the T word again. You got to test. So your tank's going to tell you when to start to test, and then the tank is going to guide you, and you have to listen to what it wants. Someone has to say goodnight. Good night, Lily. Can you say hi?
Hi.
She's
That's
always
Mark's frag.
So you have to listen to what your tank wants. It will tell you this whole thing. You don't have to guess. It will literally tell you. Okay, so then you have to start dosing when the water changes won't get the job done. Then it's time to dose. Again, if you like to get your gear up front, you already have it, it's ready to go. Now you can turn it on. Now, I understand not everyone is into automation. Some people like to do it the DIY type of way. This is actually a photo I took of a tank. It was dripping it with IV bags. I don't know where they got IV bags, but anyway, this can work. I don't recommend it because I want control. I want to be able to change things. You say goodnight.
Night.
You want to be able to change things. You want to be able to monitor things. And especially for me, when I travel a lot, if something is off.
You're not like one of the Waltons, are you? We're not going to have like 6 or 7 of those things happening, are we?
No, only 2, and no more.
Okay.
So I want to be able to control things from afar, especially with me, with my tanks when I travel, or my clients' tanks. If something's off, I want to be able to control it. If something starts going wrong, I don't want to have to be like, there's this pump with this line going into it, so one on the left, pull the plug. No, I want to be able to do that. Okay.
One of the things I always tell people too is, Mark, is that, you know, you can have aspirations of having a tank like this, and you might very well have one, at which point having the calcium reactor is a great, you know, way to go. But for most people starting out, even on a big tank, starting out, you're always going to get use out of those dosing pumps anyway at some point for something, whether it's supplemental or for other things that you want to dose in the tank. So I like to recommend to people, look, when you start out, just get the dosing pumps, right? Get the dose, and graduate to your calcium reactor when the time comes, because it also takes a little bit of there's a learning curve to running calcium reactors as well, and you got so many things going on with your tank that it's like you don't need yet another thing to have to figure out or learn right from the beginning. And dosing is so simple.
Absolutely. And on my tanks, even though I have a calcium reactor, I also have a dosing pump, for example, with alkalinity rigged up, ready to go. Terence and I were talking about this earlier. It happened to him. It happened to me. In case the calcium reactor went down the day I left to Australia for 3 weeks. So until I could get my tank buddy over there, which was going to take a couple of days, all I had to do was turn on the alkalinity doser and let it take over and handle things. So it's a very easy thing to do. So there is there's some overlap in there, but even if you have a calcium reactor, having a dosing pump as a backup isn't a bad idea. I have an alkalinity container. It's always ready to go on my tanks just in case. Okay, how do we decide between a calcium reactor and a dosing pump? I get this question a lot.
I jumped the gun on that one, huh?
Yeah, that's all right. That's okay. How do you decide? Here's how I look at it when I'm looking at a calcium reactor or a dosing pump for clients. This is what I tell people. Calcium reactors are front loaded. They're going to cost more up front. They're more labor intensive up front, but it saves you money in the long term, especially on big tanks. I tell people we're 200 gallons and up. That's when in my head I'm really starting to think we're going to go with calcium reactor on this tank. It also lets you dose trace elements that just come in when you run a calcium reactor, that if you're running dosing pumps, you have to add more dosing pumps and more liquids to do it. How do I know that? I tested for it. Here's the effluent, the water that's coming out of my old calcium reactor. These are the levels that it cranked out. Now you can see these levels are higher than what is perceived as normal seawater levels, and that's okay because per se it's dosing your tank. You want it to be cranking out higher levels of things to raise the levels. For example, calcium's 543, potassium 680. Most of these things are higher. What?
680 on the potassium? Okay, that's
Absolutely,
a little crazy.
buddy.
That's a little crazy.
The point is, it's doing its job. It's supplementing your tank. Okay.
All right.
What about dosing pumps? Here's the thing about dosing pumps. Dosing pumps are rear loaded. They cost less up front, but they're more labor intensive over time because you have to be mixing things up, replenishing things, and then it can cost you more in the long term because you have to either be mixing more of these chemicals or buying more of these chemicals. If you don't want to mix them, you have to be constantly buying that stuff. It's consumable. It's like gas for your car. You got to put gas in it. You got to put gas.
But to be honest, there is a consumable in a calcium reactor too, which is immediate. It's just a lot less expensive.
And you don't have to change it near as often.
That's correct.
Unless you're one of those people who can mix up 10 gallons of alkalinity solution and let it sit, but that's not most people. All right. Note that both of these methods, calcium reactors or dosing pumps, depend on data. You got to monitor what you're dosing. Here's the thing, using them is not linear. When you start using them, it doesn't take much of what you're supplementing, whether it be a calcium reactor or a dosing pump. It doesn't take much to get the job done because your tank doesn't have a lot of demands. Now this tank is a client's tank of mine. You know, it's starting to take off. It's looking pretty good. This tank has medium dosing demands. The tank behind me doesn't have a lot of coral. The coral isn't very good. Excuse me, it isn't very large. So this tank behind me has low dosing demand. In fact, I'm not even dosing this tank. I'm just doing a large water change once a week. Terence's tank has high dosing demands. Lots of coral in there that are taking up a lot of elements that are very big. So it's more like this when you think about dosing or supplementing your tank. It doesn't take much at the beginning, and then it takes off exponentially. How fitting that we're looking at the curve of this, given what's going on in the world. All right, so you have to have data to react. You have to know how much to dial up your dosing. Terence's tank, this is the same tank actually you just saw, high dosing demands. A lot of coral, they're very big, they're growing very fast. It's sucking up elements. So how do you know how to do this? We talked about when your water changes can't keep up with the dosing demands, then you start dosing or supplementing. So let's walk through how to set these things up. All right, let's start with the dosing pumps first. This is a straightforward process, but I get a lot of questions about people making mistakes. First, you have to know, where are you? Where are you at, as we say down here in the South, which is horrible English, but that's how we talk. Where are you? What are your alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium levels? You have to have a starting point, and you don't have to wait until all these things are low. Maybe your alkalinity is going to drop first, or your calcium. Probably one of those two is going to drop before your magnesium levels are going to drop. But still, them all aren't getting it done, then you start dosing. So let's look at an example. Say you test your calcium levels 280 parts per million. This is our starting point. Now, where do we want to end up? The de facto standard where you should be in calcium is about 440. Here's the thing about numbers. A lot of people get very bent out of shape about them. If my calcium is somewhere between 420 to 500, I'm okay with it. It's not like I have to hit 440. Maybe that's what seawater is, but look, somewhere in that range is fine. Okay, so you don't have to worry about hitting an exact number. Don't get bent out of shape about that. Then what are you dosing? There's different ways you can do it. If you want to buy it ready to go, there's various liquid solutions. There's all kinds of dry things that you can mix yourself as well. I'm not as caught up on what you dose, but there's different ways to do it. So you have to have something to dose. You can buy alkalinity solution on its own, calcium solution on its own, whatever it is. You can buy those singly. So you have to dose these things. How much do you dose? Well, all you have to do is go online, you know where you are, and then you know where you want to end up. For example, at SaltwaterAquarium.com, we have a calculator that tells you, you put in where you are, you put in where you want to end up, you have a drop-down menu for what you're dosing, and it will tell you how much to dose. Because the thing about those bottles are, their side, they say, this is how much it raises based on a 100-gallon tank, and if you have multiple of that, or like 225-gallon tank, like, what? How do I end up? So we made it easy with you with an online calculator. Okay.
But go
slow.
Dose.
What's
go
that?
Slow. You can't say this enough times. Go slow, because whatever that delta is that they tell you that you need to put in, just don't go fill up a measuring cup and go dump that in. It will definitely have dire results, especially if it's an alkalinity solution. So just usually I don't know about your guys' calculator, but they usually will tell you on there, look, hey, you need 180 milliliters of this. put 20 in every 3 hours or something.
Absolutely. I went over that with a client the other day. His alkalinity was low and he needed to put in half a gallon of solution. And I said, don't do it all at once. Put in like 100 mils a day, test and see where your tank's reacting and go from there. So then you dose. And look, you can do this automatically or you can do it manually. There's nothing wrong with mixing a solution and then dosing a little bit. But like Terence said, don't dose it all at once. Now look, if you have a 1,000-gallon tank, let's say you have a 100-gallon tank and you have to put in 5 mils, you're fine, right? But it won't hurt you to space that out, even if it's over the day or over 2 days. One of the things you don't want to do is bring your levels back very quickly. I call that snapback. If you're down here and you want to get up here, you don't want to go straight up to here. You want to slowly come up to this.
Some solutions too are going to get you, going to take a lot to get you up to there anyway. So like magnesium, for instance, you're going to be like, what? I got to put 2.5 liters of this stuff in? Are you kidding me? Funny aside, I needed to bolus dose my stuff up, and I happened to have from somebody had sent me a box of magnesium supplement, right? And it was all in like 1 liter bottles, but it was like a case of 1 liter bottles in my tank, and it felt so weird because I knew, because again, we're both experienced, right? But I knew that in 625 gallons I had, this 1 liter of this is not going to make any difference, right? So I just opened the thing up, cut the lid off, and start just, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, and then I go and wait, and the next test of my Trident, it's like up like 25, You're like, ppm. So there are some things that will, it's very hard to hurt with magnesium, but with things like especially alkalinity, but also calcium, you'll get a precipitate if you put too much in at once or you overdose.
One of the things, I don't want to say it's bad, but like if you have a large aquarium and your levels are low, like Terence said, it can take a lot to get it back up, especially with magnesium. I was so low in one of my tanks once, I needed 5 gallons of the stuff. And you're like, what? 5 gallons? Like, I don't have to top off my tank for a week. I have to put so much of this in. So it's relative. Keep that in mind. Yeah. As Terence said, you want to dose incrementally. So let's say you need to dose 250 milliliters. I might dose 100 mils a day and then put 50 in the morning and 50 in at night. You don't want to do it all at once. Then once you dose, wait a couple hours, wait till the next day, and then you test and see what you get. If you're going up slowly, that's fine. That's better than making big stair-step jumps. There's nothing wrong with going slow. You can't take things back if you dose too much. If you need to dose more, you can always increase your dose. You want to see how your tank reacts. Okay, that's dosing pumps, setting up dosing pumps in a nutshell. Let's talk about calcium reactors, because Terence and I do this very differently. Both ways work. Talk to you about how I do it. First, you got to know where you are. What are your alkalinity, calcium, magnesium levels? Because then you actually need to turn your calcium reactor on. Again, it's not like they all need to be low. One of them could just be low. Again, let's say our calcium is at 380 parts per million. Where do we want to go? Somewhere in the 440 range. Again, 420, 500, anywhere in there. I'm okay with it. Don't go bent out of shape about hitting an ideal number. The only ideal numbers for me is what my tank tells me and it's happy with. Okay, then you're supposed to adjust drips and bubbles a minute, right? You're supposed to count the drips. You're supposed to count bubbles. No, not so much. This is not how I do it. So what I do is I set the water coming out.
It was done like 15 years ago. Like 15 years ago, before there was any technology really too. That's just that's the only way they could, is like, what's your bubble rate? Okay, what's your flow rate? Okay, good. Just set it for that, and then test it tomorrow, and then test it again the next day, and then increase those bubbles. No, decrease. I mean, I really don't know. That was basically 15 years ago.
And I still see people telling them that's how it should be done. But when I do it, I make this very simple for myself and for my clients. So I set the drip rate, that's called effluent coming out of your calcium reactor, where it's just about to stop dripping or going into a steady stream of water. Right there when it's about to break, that's where I like it, okay? I set my bubbles a second to about 1 bubble a second. Now on modern day controllers for CO2, I use the carbon doser one. It has a little knob and you set it. You don't have to count it. Back in the day, you actually had to count. Drive you crazy. This is how I do it. So set those two things. And then for me, it's all about pH. Now, the way the calcium reactor works, here's a quick primer on this, is you're injecting carbon dioxide into your calcium reactor chamber. You're dropping the pH of the water in there. When that happens, the coral skeletons is basically what a coral calcium reactor media is. Coral skeletons start to dissolve. When you get low pH, the coral skeletons dissolve. That makes the water in there very rich in calcium and alkalinity and other elements. And then that effluent, the water coming out of your calcium reactor, goes into your tank. Now, I start about pH of 7.2. Now, to have a calcium reactor, you need some kind of pH controller. There's standalone ones. The Apex will do it for you, but you have to monitor pH and then turn on or off CO2 based on what the pH is doing. So I set my pH to turn on when it gets above 7.2. Look, there's not much media melting at 7.2, and that's okay. Because remember when I said when you're first.
Well, Mark, I think it stands to the one thing put here is that there's a very wide range of media that is available for calcium reactors, both in size and the composition. So you have everything from flakes of of media, calcium flakes basically, through to real coral rubble, like Two Little Fishies Reborn, which is what I use. Both of those are relatively soft, so to speak. So they will actually break down at a higher pH. All the way to the stuff like you'll see in some of those automated reactors that are out there, the recirculating automated reactors that use it's like a marble, a very hard marble, broken up marble substrate that they use, and those require clear down to almost 6 on the pH scale. So it takes a lot of acid to break those down. So it is a little bit different, and you really have to look at what media you're using.
And the data, your test results will tell you how fast that is melting. So if you're not getting much out of your media melt at first, that's okay, because remember, your tank doesn't need much. It might just need a little bump. So you don't want to crank it with this really rich effluent out of your calcium reactor. Just a little bit, just give it a little nudge. All you're doing at this point is just poking the bear a little bit, giving it a little nudge. So I know I'm not getting much out of my media reactor melt at this point for most medias, at least the ones that I use. And that's okay, right? So then I test and I see what I get. Test the results. Do I need more? Do I need less? Remember, this is a data-driven process. As things grow, like on Terence's tank, the calcium and alkalinity uptake on Terence's tank is crazy. I bet if he was dosing that thing, he'd have to put in a gallon of alkalinity a day.
At least.
So at least, right? So you test. If you're low, then all you got to do is change the pH to lower pH the faster the melt. So when you get around 7.0 for the medias that I use the Reborn stuff or mix the media as well. Right around 7 is where you start to get the horsepower out of it. That's when you know you're really putting some punch behind the thing. But again, you might not need this for a while. That's okay. A lot of people look at how I run my calcium reactor like, what? You have to get around to 6.6. That's how you're supposed to do it. I'm like, I will get there in time, but not until my tank tells me it's there. So then I test and I see, what do I, bubbles a second, drips a second, I leave that. All I do for me, what works for me, is to vary the pH. The lower the pH, the more punch I'm getting out of that effluent, and I test, and then I adjust the pH, and I let it run. So that's how I do it.
By punch, what Mark is saying is the concentration of the fluid inside the reactor is much higher in concentration. The lower the pH level in the reactor, the higher the concentration of calcium carbonate, the fluid calcium carbonate inside that reactor. And because he's talking about having a steady state on the effluent, then that is the one thing that you adjust, and it changes, how much is actually going into your tank by way of the concentration or the concentrate in there being higher.
So that's how I do it. Terence, I'm going to hand the mic to you. Walk us through how you run your calcium reactor setup.
Well, I actually have a variant off of that. I actually started doing that years and years and years ago, talking 2009 when Apex, when people were still doing all the drips and drops and everything, and that's exactly how I would do it. And then I would increase the flow rate. I also, though, now employ kind of a little bit more advanced way of doing it, which is I adjust the flow and I adjust the pH level using my Apex, and it also gets feedback from my Trident with the results to determine what it's going to do. So what happens is that under normal circumstances, mine is I think around 6.8, the pH level, or 6.85, something like that. Trying to look and see it here on my graph right here. Yeah, so let's see here. Yeah, it's right around 6.8 is normal, let's say, right? And then when my Trident says, hey, your alkalinity is getting a little bit low, it goes, okay, we're going to kick that down to 6.6. And then it runs at that until it gets the next test, right? And then it gets the next test. And if it's kind of in that same range, it keeps it at that. If it's like, oh, no, now you're, back where normal is on your alkalinity, then it goes back to 6.8. If it goes, hey, wait a second, instead of at 8.5, where you like to be, you're now at 8.7, it just shuts off the CO2 altogether and waits until the next Trident test. Now, in addition to that, I also use kind of I would call it, doctors would call this off prescription kind of off label, I guess, the kind of use for the dose to vary my output. But you could do this with other devices as well, especially if you have a lower need. You could do this with your Apex and an OSC statement, basically. Which is you could vary the amount of effluent coming out as needed. So what I generally do is leave my little program running that I have for the pH the way it is, and then I just up the effluent every little bit as I need more, right? So as soon as I look at my my Apex and it's like mostly in the 6.6 range, right? It means, oh, it's now needing so much that I should up the fluid rate, right, a little bit, and I nudge that up a little bit on the dose, and then it kind of gets where it's less likely to get into the 6.6. I'm looking at my graph right now, and it's mostly down in the 6.6 range, so it's about that time that I increase the flow rate. So probably confused everybody out there, but hey, you asked.
That's good. There's different ways to skin the cat on this thing. This is what works for both of us. I don't want people to get caught up in this is the only way to do that. When everyone tells me that's the only way to do something, other than you need salt water in a saltwater tank, red flag goes up for me. It can get very dangerous to me when I'm thinking you just have to do it.
For the basic user, what I really like, what I've seen some people do lately with these other variable speed dosing pumps that have a little knob on them, and that is they just basically lock in that pH rate, whether it's 6.8 or 6.9 or 7, as you say, and they just manually come in and just notch up the the flow rate just a little bit as their testing shows that they need more demand. It's basically like dosing 2-part, but it's dosing 1-part, and they just kind of crank it up a little bit each time. I think that's a pretty effective way to do it in the more simple approach.
Right. It doesn't have to be complicated. There's many ways to skin this cat. At the end of the day, everybody wants coils like this. Look, even if you're not a stickhead, you don't necessarily like SPS, I think you can look at this and go, you know what? That's pretty, wouldn't mind having that in my tank, or you can appreciate the beauty. Some of you are soft coral people, that's fine too. When things are really stable and rocking in your tank, I would love to have a bunch of eagle eyes like this. Chalices. The point is, you all want this to look good. We all want our tanks to look good. So let's look at a case study. This is a real life example that happened to one of my clients. This is a 90-gallon tank at the top of the stairs in a client's tank, client's house, former client of mine in Nashville, Tennessee. A little background about this tank. He set this tank up thinking that it would be a great way to get his sons involved and that his 3 sons would help him maintain the tank. That didn't happen, but the tank did really well. As you can see, it did so well that he called me one day and he said, hey, come tear it down. And I said, Doc, why? Why would you want me to tear down your tank? It looks fantastic. Like, is it leaking? Like, what's wrong? He's like, no, it's just too easy. I'm bored with it. And I'm like, okay, I guess I did my job, but that's not necessarily what, okay. So the point is the tank did really well. Here's a nice big old green slimer, Bali green slimer. Terrence, you have this in your tank, don't you? I think you see it right over your head.
Oh yeah. There's actually, I have two different kinds. I have like a blue tip green slimer right here, right above me, and then next to that, I've got another one. They're about 24 inches by about 30 inches. One of them, I guess. Yeah,
So when I do
quite
frag,
big.
I call you.
Yeah, I've already chopped it down like twice in the last 6 months. It grows like a weed.
That's a great coral. So
It
things
is.
are doing well in his tank, from SPS to LPS, all doing very, very well. So everything was going so well in his tank that he stopped testing. I told him to test like once a week. Doc, take 15 minutes, run your water test your tank. It's doing so well, he just stopped. And then one day he noticed that things looked a little off. He's like, I don't think things are really growing. The tank looks a little bit off. I guess I should test my tank's water. Okay, sure enough, he sees that the alkalinity had dropped like super low. The calcium had dropped because his reservoir was empty. He thought he was dosing stuff, but he never checked. So his pump had been running, but there wasn't any liquid running through it. So all the parameters are off. Only once things are off did he break on his test kit. As I said, it's a data-driven process. If he had been tested all along, he would have caught that drop and avoided the pitfalls that he had. Now, here's the thing. If you look at your tank every day, some people are like, yeah, I can look at it and I can tell when things are off. Maybe so, but if your growth slows down very slowly over time, you're not going to be able to tell the difference until you start looking at photos. If you take them and you're like, that was 3 months ago, this is now, not much has changed. Testing will tell you what's going on with your tank. Test your tank's water. And yes, now there are ways that your will do this for you. It will let you know what you've dosed. It will tell you how much you've dosed, how much you have left. If he had done this, it's better than nothing, but I still like to test the tank's water, because sometimes things go over the cliff. And once you go over the cliff, once you're down in the gully in the ravine and tore off your front bumper like this car, it's too late. This is what happens to Tennessee drivers when they hear that it might snow. People freak out. So I see lots of posts tanks to go south, and then they start testing, and then they figure out that they have a problem, in which case you probably missed it. It happened way long and far back in time, but you weren't paying attention, you weren't testing, so you don't know what happened, and you don't know where you're supposed to be. So tanks can talk to you, they can recover, but the bad thing about reefing is it doesn't take long for something to go, but it takes a long time to get things back on track. Okay. And yes, if you have an apex, look, all this will log is for you, and it'll even tell you what's the low and what's the high. It's doing this math for you. It's making the data really, really easy for you. And then if your pH gets too high, it might be that your alkalinity doser is stuck on. That can be a clue for you. All this is part of it. Again, it's logging this. Here's the max. Okay, I know I'm somewhere in this range. That's normal. This is establishing those baselines. And of course, you can set programs up. Here's just a quick example. I know that my tank ran around 8.2 pH as a maximum. So I'm going to say if the pH gets above 8.3, turn off my alkalinity doser. And oh, by the way, send me an alert too, because that means something is wrong, right? So there's ways to set this up to help save your tail. I still like to test my tank. All right, let's talk about when you get to the point when you've been dosing your tank and running your calcium reactor, things are going really well, and then you want to push the envelope a little bit, okay? You can cheat a little bit, all right? There's some wiggle room that I talked about earlier. Look, tanks can adapt, especially older tanks. When the parameters get out of whack, then everything can look okay. There's more of a delta and kind of error range that you have. Now, if everything looks okay, that's not an excuse to get. I still want to have data to know what works for the tank. It's not going to be forgiving forever. And then if you have to make up a big difference between where you are, where you want to be, like Terence talked about earlier, it can require a lot of two-part dosing, and that's going to add a lot more to your workload in terms of caring for your tank and be more of a pain in your tail. Your tank is going to be given forever. We want to make these little changes. We don't want to have to make big changes, all right? So it's not going to be forgiving forever. And look, things may not go the way that it's planned, but don't get upset about it if you stop testing your tank or monitoring your tank. You can't sit there and be paranoid about it. Again, look at your tank. You're going to get to the point where you can look at your tank and go, okay, everything looks good. Or you know what, something just seems off. There's a little bit of feel that you're going to get when you're really communicating with your tank. The point is still test, have a baseline so you know. Corals can adjust and trick you. And if you stir your tank every day, it's hard to tell. You're likely not going to notice until a long ways down the road. Then you have to make big changes for it. Here's a client's tank, just to give you an idea. This tank has a high coral growth demand. I run an Apex on this tank. His Trident keeps an eye on things. He's actually left his house because he's in a populated area where the coronavirus is very prevalent right now. He went to his lake house 2 hours away. He has someone feeding his fish and just looking at stuff, but we can keep an eye on it from afar, and the tank looks really, really good. He has everything dialed in, but I still have him testing. He still sends off water. We're still keeping an eye on things with that tank. Don't get lazy just because things look good. Yes, I want it to look good. You want to dial in your tank. You want to be able to listen to it. But again, stay with it, enjoy what you got, and keep things very predictable. All right, with that, Terence, I'm at the end of my slides. I'm going to open it up to question and answer sessions just a second. Is there anything that you want to go over before I open it up to the people tuning in?
Well, I just want to reiterate, my own philosophy really is, if you're starting out, and as Mark says, probably almost certainly below 200 gallon tank, start out with dosing pumps, whichever type they happen to be. You don't have to get it right away. You'll probably need it, 3 to 6 months into having your tank. You'll probably want to be doing it consistently as opposed to bolus dosing or dosing as you see it's needed from testing. So use a dosing pump of some sort. I would prefer you use ours from Neptune Systems dose, but I would definitely go that route to start out with in those tanks until you build up enough corals in the tank. Or if you happen to be a person who loves to tinker, who loves to have the gear, and you don't mind learning a lot, then go with the calcium reactor thing. But it certainly is not a plug it in, fire and forget it kind of device. It requires you to invest some time and understanding in what's going on, or you will be frustrated. So I tell most people there's enough frustration to go around when you're starting off a tank that, start with dosing and understand, as Mark says, what your real needs are. Don't just look at a bottle and go, well, it says if I've got a tank this size, start with 10 mil a day and then see what happens. No, it's not what you need to do. So, it's definitely that, and figure out too I try to tell this to everybody. Look at somebody's tank that you say, that's what I want to have. And then more or less, if they're successful for a long time, emulate what they're doing and what they have, right? So if you are into, a more softy tank or a mixed reef tank, that's fine. But the requirements on that are going to be a lot different than what you see behind me here, which doesn't make it super hard necessarily. I don't find this super difficult. It's just different. So, test, as Mark says, I'm horrible at this, and I'm lulled into, the same kinds of things, the lazy, Lars, definitely myself. And I haven't run a nitrate or phosphate test in a long time. And mostly because I have the Trident, believe it or not. It doesn't do nitrate or phosphate, but because it does the other three, I don't pull out any test kits, which I usually would pull out my alkalinity and calcium test, and then go, I might as well do phosphate and nitrate while I'm just here to get the tests out. Now that I don't do that, they don't get done. That's about all I can add to that, Mark.
And that you're looking at an SPS tank here on the slide. You're looking at an SPS tank behind Terence. Those tanks have high demands. If you're a softy person, you might not ever have to dose your tank. Water changes may get the job done for you. Heck, you might not even have to do water changes.
In a small enough tank.
Sure.
Tank. I think in a bigger tank, because again, that coral and algae situation really can make a big difference. And you can make up, most people can make up, even if they've got a 50-gallon tank, they'll make up 20, 30 gallons. It's not that big of a deal for them, right, to replenish. But if you've got that 150-gallon mixed reef tank, and you've got a ton of coral and algae growing in there, it's going to take a lot repeatedly to be able to catch back up with that. I will disagree with you slightly there, Mark.
Look, there's some gray area. The point is, you're going to test, your tank's going to tell you what it needs, and then you're going to react and give it what it needs. I'm not a fan of dosing equal parts of things because that's what it says. If the alkalinity is low, but the calcium isn't, okay, I'm gonna add some alkalinity. If the calcium's high, then I'm not gonna add any calcium. I let the tank drive the show. At time, you're gonna figure out what it likes, where it likes to hang out. I've had tanks that like to hang out around 5 points per million on nitrates and 2.0 on phosphates. And by the books, I would be like, that's crazy. There's no way SPS would grow in there. SPS grow like weeds, but if something was wrong with the tank, and then I tested and was like, wow, phosphates are 2, I better throw some GFO in there and get that down. If I didn't have the data to know that the tank was doing really well and it was okay with this level of phosphates, then you can make your parameters take a nosedive, and then the tank won't be happy. Again, I'm trying to keep things level as much as I can. With data, I know what works for my tank, Terence's tank, your tank. Every tank is different. Just learn to listen to it.
Yeah, don't do like I do and don't test. Part of that is a dissonance thing too, because my tank is doing well. I really don't want to know, as he just said, that my nitrates right now are 25 probably, and my phosphates are 8 or something like that, because it's entirely possible.
It is, and if you know that's where your levels are and that's what works, then if something goes wrong and your levels are that high, you're not going, that seems awfully high for an SPS tank. So I'll have to gig Terence to, I'll buy more Apex stuff, Terence, if you test and send me your test results. How's that? Well,
I bet you there's some people out there on this webinar right now that's saying, no, he just needs to make one of those devices, and you get those guys at Neptune Systems to make one of the devices to test everything. That way we don't have to do any of it.
Yeah. You still gotta at some point you have to be able to run a test and know how to do it. There's some rite of passage. I mean,
that's what I was trying to say in the beginning. Yeah, if you're not going to be into testing, this is probably not the hobby for you, because you're going to have to do it.
I remember doing long division, and then one day they gave you a calculator, which now sits on your phone. But when Terence and I were in school, it was TI-85, which was like the shizzle type of thing. All right, so it's let's turn it over some question and answer sessions. If you don't want to ask your questions and have me call on you and we hear your voice, that's fine. You can write a question in the little text window, and we'll get to you as well. So either way is fine. We'll mix it up between people this evening. And if you're watching this on your phone or tablet, you can swipe left and see Terence and I's talking heads, as opposed to just staring at the screen to give you something else to look at. So let's go to the live questions first. If I call on you, make sure you unmute your microphone so that we can hear you, so we can hear your very interesting question. All right, let's go. I always start at the top. Let's start at the top of the alphabet. If you have a question, raise your hand. All right, Brad Tannehill, I'm going to call on you. Brad, you are live. Looks like you got your microphone muted. Nope, no, he's there. Brad, are you with us?
Yeah, Mark, I'm right here.
Awesome. Thanks for calling.
Hello?
Yeah, have at it.
I have a mixed reef tank, and I just want to get your opinion on the ATI Essentials Pro 2-part, where you dose 1-to-1 to try to stabilize your tank.
Okay, great question, because I get asked this a lot, and there's some people that say you should only dose equal parts of calcium and alkalinity. Me personally, I do what my tank tells me to. There's plenty of times when calcium is low and alkalinity isn't, or vice versa, or whatever combination. So if one of them is low or high, then I will or will not dose. I do what my tank tells me that it wants. I don't try to squeeze it in a box. That's what works for me.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on that. The idea that there is an exact locked ratio that works when you get these products is an absolute myth. It is not the case. It is at best a swag at saying, yes, we're going to get this as close as we can to being a match set, so to speak, or where they should be, so you can dose them 1-to-1. But they will, based on a number of things, fall out of sync. In fact, I don't know if it's the product. I think the ATI Essentials product actually uses a formate-based calcium in there as well, which also changes based on the the organisms in the tank basically turn over the formate into calcium. So that can also be a different makeup in terms of how much actually goes into your tank. And so the idea that they're the same, not going to be there. And in fact, in the products that have formate in them, I think all-in-one, Tropic Marin, all for reef, or one of those also is a formate-based product. Those products too, you can't just go ahead and test right after you put the stuff in, or even maybe even 5 minutes after it's in and it's all mixed up, because the tank itself has to basically, the bacteria eats the formate and turns it into the calcium. So it takes time for that process to actually happen.
Great question. All right, Tyler, we'll go to the bottom of the alphabet here. Tyler H, you're live. Tyler, go ahead and unmute your mic. Have at it, Tyler.
Yeah, so learning curve and cost aside, is there any advantages or disadvantages to starting with a calc reactor, then moving to a calcium reactor, or vice versa?
Right, great question about calc wasser. What is there a disadvantage to do that? So I didn't talk about calc tonight. I do use calc, but I didn't talk about it because it's my experience that it has to be dripped into your tank. A lot of people with smaller systems where you got everything underneath the tank, a lot of times people don't have room for it. Now, if you have a fish room or you have more space, it can make sense. I do like to use calc. It is something that I used to run in my top off tank. I don't do that anymore because I want more control over it. Calc adds alkalinity and it adds calcium to your tank. So I will do that after my water changes can't keep up with my demands, and before I might want to add a dosing pump or a calcium reactor, then I'll add a calc reactor in there. They're not that hard to run. I don't do it in my top off tank anymore. I like doing it in a calc reactor because then I can put in as much as I need as opposed to waiting for a top off event, which can vary. And then if something goes wrong and you top off your whole container and it's with calc, then it can cause things to go wrong. So do like calc. I really can only find that it works in people that have a little more space underneath their tanks or fish room.
I'm not a fan at all.
You do run it on your tank?
I don't, and I think the only people that really should be running it is if you have a pH problem, either induced by room air or because of how much calcium reactor additive, so to speak, at a low pH is going into your tank, and to try to balance that out because you have a huge demand in your tank. Outside of that, where I see it used way too much, in my opinion, are beginner reef keepers who are looking for an easy and inexpensive way to supplement their tanks. And because they are beginner reef keepers and they don't have a full understanding of everything that's going on, or sometimes they are budget gearing it or whatever associated with this, you dump that thing into your tank and it's all over. And it's very, very dangerous compared to most other things that you dose. It's not to say you can't have a problem with a dosing pump with with just running a carbonate, on the tank. You can, but it's generally not the same as a calc wasser event, and that's why I don't like it.
Awesome, there you go. Different opinions. This is making it fun tonight. Matthew S, you are live. I'm gonna unmute you here. Matthew, make sure you turn on your mic. Have at it, Matthew.
Hey guys, I was wondering how important is it to, if you're using a two-part dosing system and you have a pump set up on that, how important is it to have that dose throughout the day as opposed to once a day? So I just realized on my tank that I was having about 0.8 drop in between one day to the next.
Okay, so that's a great question. So if you have a dosing pump, it should have the capabilities for you to tell it how often you want it to dose, or dose this much over the course of the day, and it will break it up for you. Absolutely do it. Adding a little bit at a time is better. Like Terence mentioned earlier tonight, absolutely use that capability. That's one of the reasons you're automating. Use that capability of that automation. If you're seeing a 0.8 diff a day, look, that's doing good. That's things are cranking in your tank. Doing it all at once, and then it can raise that level, and then it'll fall back during the day. Or if you're just bumping it a little bit, giving a little push throughout the day by dosing little amounts, absolutely do that. Why not? I mean, the Neptune Systems dose, which I use for dosing, is great for that. You tell it when you want to dose, which for me is 24 hours, and I tell it how much I want to dose, and then it does the math for you, and it just runs it a little bit, how many times it needs to during the day. It's great.
Well, one of the things, to bring it back to this particular webinar and testing, right? The reason, first of all, absolutely what Mark said, that's the reason to do it. I absolutely would have it. It doesn't have to be, every 10 minutes, but it certainly should be like every hour, right? That definitely is much better for the tank. And you probably also don't do it overnight. So you're really only doing, say, 18 hours of the day or 16 hours of the day, and you split it up between those. One of the really nice things about doing it with the dose, and I am going to plug here because it is a great thing that isn't in existence in any others that I've seen thus far, is you set the time period and how much that you want to dose, and then you test, the next week, and you're like, wow, my tank needs a little bit more. You only have to go in and change one number, and it adjusts the whole thing for you throughout the whole day all over again. So that's a really big advantage because it splits it up all over again for you. So sometimes, a couple more dollars in the technology saves you a whole lot of time and headaches, for sure. This is one of them.
So let's go to a text question here. Brian wants to know, what's the best time to dose alkalinity and calcium, morning or afternoon? All right, Brian, part of it depends on how much you need to dose, and there's some value you could argue for dosing alkalinity at night when normally your pH of your tank drops. I used to chase that number. I don't do that anymore. I just let it run all day long. pH is not something that I chase. Someone else had a text question about raising pH. If my pH is anywhere from 7.7 to 8.6, I don't care. I'm not going chasing things. Those of you who followed me for a while, my old 90-gallon tank, its pH would run 7.6 to 7.9. If it was not too hot, then I could open the windows and get it above 8, and that thing grew corals like weeds. I was dosing a lot of calcium alkalinity and magnesium to keep up with it. So I don't go crazy about pH numbers. I'm just not a fan of it. I don't see the need to do it. So great question. Look, for me, just dose it throughout the day, especially calcium. If you want to fiddle, you can dose your alkalinity a little heavier at night, but just make it easy.
I do 80% sun up to sundown, 20% overnight. That's how I do it.
There you go. Perfect. Great question. All right, let's get a lady reefer. Can we get any lady reefers live? Who's got a question here? Ladies always tend to get overlooked in the hobby. Still figured that one out. Let's see here. Oh, Amy. No, Amy didn't have her hand up. So we have any text questions here from a lady reefer? Ladies are always quiet. All right, Amy asked about pH, so we answered that one, Amy. I don't go chase that number. Let's see, who has a live question here? Who is just dying to get it answered? All right,
I can't
Leo,
see any of those, by the way, so I can't help you out.
You can't help me out? All right, well, Leo, unmute your mic. You got your mic mute. Leo C, fire away. There you go.
Hey, Mark. Hey, thanks for taking me on. Really enjoy your show. I learn a lot from you guys. This is perfect timing for me. I just got a auto doser that I'm going to be setting up, but it just seems like I'm consistently low on my alk, and and I can't get it up. Is there something that could cause it to not raise, Mark? My magnesium's good, but the other two, I am having a hard time getting them raised to the levels that they should be.
Now, are you mixing up your dosing solution, or are you buying?
It's a two-part. I get, and you add your RODI water to it in the 1 gallon containers. And, I'm dosing anywhere from 50 to 100 milliliters a day on each of those. And even when I've tried to raise it, like I put a lot in there and tried to get those numbers up, and it just won't seem to go for me.
What do you mean by numbers up? I mean, first of all, what are you dealing with? I mean, how big is the tank? How long has the tank been established? And, what are your numbers? What are you trying to get to, and where are the numbers hanging out?
My tank's a 180 with a 50 gallon sump, this one's been set up for 5 years. It's well established. I got SPS, LPS, softies, it's a happy tank. There's no doubt about it. And it almost, am I not testing it right, or my test kit's bad? I'm just lost almost.
Well, again, I think it really depends where those numbers are, but I know tanks for sure kind of will hang out sometimes in I'm kind of okay mode, but not grow and not thrive. Let's say they're not dying off, but they're not thriving. Okay. And as soon as you give them a boost, right, they'll suck all that down and start to go again. Right. And then, they actually have the ability to even consume more and more as it goes. And you'll see that happening in the numbers. I know, Mark, you can probably comment on this on tanks that you have that have been kind of in a stalled state. And then all of a sudden you start to dose them, you start to get the tank in good shape. And you're like, wow, how can this possibly use twice what it used before?
Absolutely. And, your test kits, that would be one place to check. Make sure your test kits reagents haven't expired. Send off your water to test it, get your buddy over there and have him bring his test kit. Maybe your test numbers are wrong. Maybe you switch to another solution, dosing solution, maybe a bottle solution, and you see what you get. Something's got to raise it. At some point, it could be that all of a sudden you took things off like Terence, or the tank took off, as Terence was just alluding to. All those are places where I would look on why can't you get your tank's numbers up. Great question, not a bad problem to have.
One last thing on that too is that, and Mark didn't touch on this in his presentation, but there's a thing called confirmation bias, which you need to be really careful about when you're testing, which is you think that this is where it should be, so this is where the color change happens all the time, right? And it just kind of happens that way. So if you're ever in doubt, run that test 2 times or 3 times until you get some consistency. And then, as Mark said, use another test kit from somebody else or a brand new test kit of a different type. Good question.
Yeah, great question. Not a bad problem to have either. All right, let's see. Thomas, you have your hand up, but it says you don't have a mic. So check on your microphone there. Let's go jump up to the questions. All right, Gabe N, I'm gonna unmute you here, buddy. Turn on your mic and fire away.
Hey, Mark, thanks for your time and sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you for being here.
Hey, I was wondering, except for maybe coralline algae and a softy tank, is there any extra dosing that would be required?
So that's a good question. So I think there's an argument about, softies take up iodine. I think that's more of a, kind of anecdotal type thing. I haven't seen any real data on that. Dosing iodine is pretty dang tricky. You can go very wrong very quickly. The test kits for it aren't that great. If you're having a softy tank, just do some heavy water changes. You'll be fine. It's very likely going to take care of things. I would not try to thread the needle with iodine. It's just too much of a risk to do it.
Yeah, in a lot of softy tanks, you can keep a softy tank at 6.5 or 7 DKH on the alkalinity and maintain it there just fine with the water changes, and the water changes are going to give you all of the other trace elements that you need to really have probably in that tank with a good salt.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with the nice softy tank. I get it. It's not necessarily my taste, but I see a big softy tank and I'm like, that's pretty. And I know maintenance on the thing, it's got to be next to nothing because they love dirty water. Even LPS. I mean, this tank behind me here, my Lobos that I took out of my 448 gallon and put in this tank, I don't think they've ever looked better. Because the water in here is probably very dirty. I'm going to tell myself I haven't tested this tank for nitrates because I don't care. It's a holding tank. Once a week, I do a 30-gallon water change on a 210-gallon tank. Actually, more than that, it's about 60 because it's just easy. When I empty the sump, that's how much I have to put back in. I'm like, whatever, forget it. The corals will cap me. I don't really have any SPS in here, just some frags that I'm like, let's just see how they do. So there's definitely some, SPS tanks require more attention. Softies, not much.
Actually, that tank back there looks like an NPS tank to me, non-photosynthetic. You know?
No light on, right? My lighting scheduled to be on when I'm on the webinar. So Simon from Canada, Terence, is giving you a shout out for your Let's Talk Reef and your Skimate podcast. He says he's a big fan. He loves it. Thanks for keeping us informed during these difficult times. So why don't you talk about that for a quick minute, Terence?
What's that? Talk about what? Sorry, you broke up.
Yeah, talk about Let's Talk Reef and Skimate podcast real quickly while I queue up some more questions.
Yeah. So Let's Talk Reef is every other Tuesday with myself and usually Paul from Neptune Systems doing some of the technical stuff, talking about not just Neptune gear, but kind of reef keeping in general from the Neptune Systems headquarters in Morgan Hill, California. We do it every other Tuesday. The next one will be this Tuesday. We do them at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern time. Just tune in on Facebook or YouTube, either one, because we broadcast simultaneously to both. Yeah, we'd love to get your questions and have you join us there. Also, I do a podcast with Richard Ross called Skimate, the Skimate podcast. And we usually put out an episode about every 2 weeks. We've been a little slow lately, but you can go out and listen to one of 11 episodes. We're up to 11 now. And hear us kind of argue about reef keeping and talk about kind of some of the things that are happening for the day in reef keeping. We have some of the same philosophies, like you got to run an apex. I don't speak for him. He's an apex, nut as well. But also some things that we don't agree on, like he doesn't run a refugium with Cato, and I do. And I love it. So we talk about all kinds of things like that, or stuff people add to the tank that hasn't been proven, all kinds of things. You can find that on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever, or skimate.com.
Or Skimate. You own skimate.com. That's fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely drop me on that one. All right, let's see. Let's go. Amir up here at the top of the outfit has had his hand up for a while. Amir, you're live. Make sure you turn on your mic. It says you don't have your mic on, so now's your time to shine. There you go. Are you with us, Amir?
Hey guys. Nice to meet you, Mark and Terence.
Hey, Amir.
Appreciate you taking my question. The question I had was I recently set up a calcium reactor, and one of the ways that I'm controlling it is by controlling how long the CO2 is dosed throughout the day using the Apex. So I set it up so that it doses a little high, and then I basically stop the CO2 for a certain period of the day. I just want to know what you guys think about that, if you guys think that's an okay idea or it could have some problems.
So what you're saying is that you set the pH level is set for a particular level, but you basically just turn it off and turn it on at a certain time of day, or you don't have any pH control and you're just doing bubbles and turning it on and off at a certain time of day.
No, I do have the pH controlled, so it's around, it basically flatlines at around 6.8. And what I found is that with that, my alkalinity is usually rising over a few days. So then what I do is I basically, for a certain period of the day, I just basically turn off the CO2 completely.
Perfectly reasonable.
And
totally
use that.
Reasonable. Yeah, it's actually the exact way people are doing it with Trident controlled calcium reactors right now. A lot of people aren't going to the geeky level I did, and they just go, yeah, I kind of set it up so it works at this rate, but it's kind of not perfect. So, but it's kind of overdosing the tank, right? As you were saying, and then I just turn it off, whenever the Trident comes out and says, yeah, my alkalinity is a little high. You've done that through a manual process, which is just fine, and you figured that out. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way at all.
Got it. Thank you, guys.
Hey, thank you.
No problem.
All right, let's go to a text question here. Terence, Christopher wants to know, how long did it take your tank to go from frag to where it is now, so that everyone can get an idea of growth?
So I actually just got some of the Facebook histories on it. I put the stand down five years ago. So the tank but it took it about a year and a half before I really put really any serious corals into the tank at all. So the oldest corals that are in here right now of SPS corals are about 3.5 years old. You know, I have progression. If you go out to tinyurl.com/Fugazzi425, you can see the build thread. It's out on Reef to Reef, or if you go to reef2reef.com and just search for Gilroy, you'll find my, that's where I live, Gilroy. You'll find the build thread out there. And you can kind of see some progression pictures along the way as well. Once the tank, about 1.5 to 2 years ago, right? That would have been about 1.5 to 2 years into the tank, okay? Everything can boom, kicks off, right? And you'll see the green slimer, the original picture of the green slimer. The green slimer has been in here now, I want to say just about 2 years. And it's probably, including, if I included the cuttings on it, it's probably grown 3.5 feet if I were to let it continue to grow from what it was. And that was from a 2-inch frag. So it really has to do with a couple of things, because I know this is kind of the follow-up question that a lot of people have. Well, how is that possible? You know, I don't see that happening in everybody's tanks. It really has to do with the consistency. If your tank's not, as I said, always trying to adjust and accommodate, well, now I'm running at 9 DKH, and now I'm running at 7.5, and now I'm running it at 81 degrees, and now I'm running at 78 degrees, and everything is always trying to adjust to it. If everything is kind of always copacetic and even and everything, then the tank just starts to go nuts. It really does. And this is why having not automation for the sake of taking away your own capabilities for doing something, it's basically, it can do what you can't do, which is keep this really nice continuity in the tank, so that you can get the growth out of it that you'd like to get. So yeah, that's about 3 years, I'd say, is, I mean, right behind me, you can't see it right now. Oh, maybe you can, I don't know. You can't see, yeah, right here. This is actually a red planet that went in 2 years ago as a frag, 2.5 years ago. It's now about 16, 17 inches around, something like that, all the way up to the glass. So it's pretty crazy. You got to cut it now. Now it's like having a garden.
So I know when I get my new tank up, I'm calling you for frag steerings.
Yeah, I'm here, man. Trust me. You can just fly out and just take home a cooler, bring an igloo.
Yeah, I'll do it. You hit on a good point too, Terence, which is you talked about your tank really started to take off. You felt like 1.5, 2 years in. I tell clients, me designing your tank and building the tank is the easy part. Maintaining it, getting it going, that's where there's a lot of unknowns, and because everyone wants a tank like yours in the background or the one here on the slides. Everyone just thinks if they built a great tank with all the right components, it'll just happen. Every tank is different. And in my experience, the first year of your tank's life, it's like an immature child. It kicks and screams at you, it does really well, and then for no apparent reason, it goes off the rails and it has a hissy fit, and then for no apparent reason, it can come back. It's just something about the biology or the chemistry that we don't know. So if you're just starting your tank count and it's all over the board, that's okay. Don't try to cram it in a box. Just be patient with it. Those of you with kids can relate. Get it to calm down, track your data, and start looking for the trends. I found about the year range, sometimes it's 1.5 and maybe 2 years. At some point that tank will lock in, and then things go. And then when you're testing and you really know what works, then you can find out what is happy for your tank. Because what works for me is different what works from Terence, not only in how we do things, but how his tank likes to run is different than mine. It's fun to compare notes, but I'm not necessarily trying to cram my tank into a box. Good point about that. So Phil wants
also before Phil's question, really, especially that early on, don't mess with things. And even now, I could take a camera right now and show you how many frags people would probably freak out, how much crap is down in my sand bed right now, right? Of like frags and corals and break-offs and, snails that went upside down or whatever it is. And I don't reach in there and go mess with that stuff, right? A coral falls over, this thing or that. It's partly because I'm lazy, and it's partly because I know it's not a good idea. When I stick my hands in the tank, things happen. I break corals off, things happen. I'm introducing stuff from my hands into the tank. All of these things, I'm really a big proponent of keep your hands out of your tank as much as possible, and you'll have a much better tank.
Absolutely. That's It's fun when you get the new toy and you want to fiddle with it, but the best thing you can do with it is to just look at it. If you want to touch something, you can touch the equipment and like, oh, okay, and then take your hand off. But the less
there is no magic bottle. Whatever the bottles are, I've like added like one thing to this tank to correct something in the tank in the 3.5-4 years it's been up and running, right? And that was to get rid of the bryopsis with the, what do you call it, Propanol or whatever. That was the only thing I've done in this tank. That's the only thing. I haven't added all these other, potions and everything. I just don't.
Just don't go there. So speaking of adding things, Phil wants to know what can he dose to get coral and algae? Because I actually was asked once if I could overnight coral and algae scrapings to Hong Kong, and I was like, if you really wanted, I could. But here's the thing about coral and algae. It tends to just show up on its own. There is a purple up type of product, which I'm not a fan of. I found that tanks just start growing coral and algae for no apparent reason. And it doesn't mean that your tank is doing great if it is growing it, and it doesn't mean that your tank is doing bad if you don't grow it. I've seen plenty of great looking Terence's tank, and they don't have any coral and algae in them whatsoever. Like, not because they scrape it off, because it just doesn't grow it. So in my experience, at some point it just starts showing up in your tank. A lot of times it's got to come from somewhere. It's not like it just lives in the air. So it can come in on coral frag. Some people like to buy frags with a plug because it has some coral and algae on there. You can ask someone for some rubble. There's different ways to do it, but Phil, I found that it just shows up, and if it never shows up in your tank, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right, I agree 100%. And if you do like it though, I mean, well, first of all, not all coral and algae is good, right? And 98% of it is fine. It's inert. It's not a problem. There's actually some coral and algae that are aggressive, and you have to take your tank down because of them. It's very rare, but it can happen. But most of the time, it is coming from somebody, that it's just all unintentional, right? Believe it or not, Mark, there is a product out now with coral and algae seeding in the product. Now, Purple Up is not that. Purple Up is a microfine calcium something or other slurry or whatever, and it's whatever. I don't believe in that stuff either. But there is a new product, and I have not tried it, and of course cannot vouch for it, but supposedly has actual coral and algae in the bottle. But I would just say exactly what Mark said, which is if you want some coral and algae, have somebody break off a piece of rock in their tank and throw it in your tank in a kind of a dark spot in the tank, or not a bright spot, I should say. It's a little bit of light, and you'll have all the coral and algae you want.
Yeah, I was just in I had a ridiculous fish room preview of coming attractions. Yes, I filmed it. Yes, I am going to cut a video on it. But in his fish room, far away from any lights, reef tank lights that per se would grow coral and algae, he has coral and algae growing in everything. His media reactors, his protein skimmer, for no apparent reason. Like, he has room lights, like fluorescent strips like you would find in an office building. And he has coral and algae everywhere. He doesn't get it, but he's like, I just grow coral like mad in this place. So sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. All right, let's jump to the final evening. I'm going to go up to north of the border for Scott B. Scott, you are on. Go ahead and unmute your mic so we can hear you. Are you with us, Scott?
You bet. Hey, Mark, Terence, thanks for taking the call.
Absolutely.
I guess you guys just got into this, I think, while I have my hand up, but you guys have covered the main dosing, alkalinity, magnesium, but the plethora of additives, be it coral colorization, trace elements, coral food, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you guys stand on those in general?
So great question, Scott. So one, because you talked about coral food and someone was asking about coral food. I personally do not feed my corals. The only time I will feed a coral is if it's non-photosynthetic, because I have to have it, or if a coral is struggling. Really LPS. A lot of the LPSs, they don't travel well, bubble corals. Sometimes scullies can get damaged in shipping because they're really fleshy with that hard skeleton. Maybe something fell on it, it got stung, then I'll feed that LPS. Otherwise, I don't feed my tanks. I found it just, whenever I do it, it tends to lead to algae outbreaks. corals are photosynthetic. Yes, they're going to get some food from feeding, but the amount of food that it actually gets by putting it in your tank is very low. It's equivalent to me like those wind machines where you can get in them and they blow all the money around and you have to grab the money. And most of the time they don't end up getting much money because it's the same in your tank. You got the flow on and your broadcast feeding that's just dumping food in, it's blowing all over your tank. They're not really going to get much, very much at all. It's a low probability. Even if you squirt it right on there, again, it's a low probability. You're not going to gain for what damage that you could do. And I'm a little bit like Terence and Lazy Reefer. I'm not going to turn off the flow on my tank and make up my coral food and squirt it at each individual coral. I can't imagine, Terence, you doing that in your tank. Can you forget it? So I'm not a fan of doing that. What about these other trace elements? It's my experience that those things are just, they're too hard to chase. You can't accurately test them. You know, even the ICP test, I feel like there's enough error range in there to try to microdose your tank based on the water tests on those. I don't do it. If you have a calcium reactor, it's very likely taking care of your trace needs. If you wanted to fiddle with it, I would do it on a small scale, but Terence talked about confirmation bias. If you're dosing it, you're likely going to be like, oh yeah, things are definitely working. How can you tell? Well, it just looks different. Like, of course it looks different because you want it to look different. It's hard to actually monitor those things. So I like to keep it simple, and I just don't do it. Terence, what is your take on that?
So there's a few different things here. So let me try to unpack them all the best way I can. So in reverse of what you were talking about, the additives that talk about trace and the systems, so to speak, with those, not a proponent of those at all, because I don't believe that you can regulate them in any way that is going to be objective, right, very easily. And in that case, what's the point, right? So I know if I've got enough, or do I need more, or how do I know? And there's no objective way really to tell. And certainly, except for those that are like Triton or something that's paired up with a system of measurement, you absolutely aren't going to know. And the ratios in the bottles are set, so it's not like you can break it up, right, if something's low and something's not low. So I'm not a big fan of those. What I do like in a tank, and the one thing that I do dose regularly, is an amino acid. So aminos, I think, are good for the tank. I do use AquaPower on my tank. It is the one thing from one person that I trust who will not sell something unless he's personally tested. That's Julian Sprung. You know, he knew for years that he got anecdote that, you know, these aminos were good. I used to use the Salifert product. But he didn't believe it at first, and then he went through a bunch of testing and saw it did make some differences and came up with a formula, and that's the formula I use. That's really the only thing that I dose other than, you know, 2-part or calcium, magnesium, et cetera. So I'm a fan of those. Coral foods that are liquid coral foods in general, just to feed corals, whether it's like coral snow or whatever, I think it's a waste of money for the most part. Those, you know, the bottles that you find on the average shelf, right? Snow, so to speak. It's like more expensive than caviar for the amount of actual nutrients that are probably in that bottle compared to water. So I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm not a fan of adding pods to the tank, right? Unless I maybe had a really small tank with a mandarin or something, right, in it that I needed to feed and I had to supplement and it wasn't eating. That's the only way I would do pods in a tank like that, because you're going to get pods and amphipods and everything anyway and other methods. And then there's powdered coral foods. I do use them from time to time. Do I know they work? Do I know that they're doing anything? No. I've been given a couple of different products. Some of them tell me to mix it up and then wait for like 10 minutes. By that time I forget and it's on the counter and it's the next day. So I don't generally do those things. Although once every couple of weeks I'll go, hey, what the heck? Let's throw some nutrients in the tank, and I'll mix up a concoction of reefroids and a couple of others, you know, that are out there. And so I'll do that. But really, for me, I think the most successful thing to dose into your tank is good food for your fish, and let them poop it out, let them pee it out into your tank. And that's going to be all you need for great corals, in my opinion, is really good food. Because really, you know, we're not going to have live planktons and stuff like the ocean has anyway. So, you know, that's really enough, in my opinion. They're going to poop right at sunset. Still, they're going to poop at night. So the corals are going to eat. And my results of this tank and the tank I had before, that's it. I used to get asked all the time, well, what kind of special coral foods are you giving? And I'm like, none really. Spectrum pellets. I mean, back in the day, I didn't even feed like boutique foods. I'll call them like LRS. I call that boutique food, right? It's like, I've got enough money now. I can afford to buy boutique food for my fish, right? It's great stuff. I mean, it's the best stuff out there in my opinion. But before that, I had a great coral tank too, and all I did was throw spectrum pellets into things and some flakes that were probably old, like way too old. So there you go. Did I unpack it all there, Mark, for the final question?
No, I'm impressed. You got it all off memory, and it's the end of the evening as well. For you, it's only 8:15.
It's the coffee.
It's the coffee. It's a lot of coffee while you're at it.
It's a big mug.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks for being with us, Terence, on a Sunday evening. I hope you are doing well in California. Everyone, thanks for being with us. We'll be back next Sunday evening. If you want to email us with the topic, you can do that. sales@saltwateraquarium.com. You can send a message on my Facebook as well, whatever works for you. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for taking time. Stay safe.
Let's Talk Reef on this Tuesday. Okay, Neptune Systems Facebook page, Neptune Systems YouTube page, either one for Let's Talk Reef. Hashtag Let's Talk Reef. You can go see old episodes on that. And we also do Control Freak Wednesdays, which will be a week from Wednesday. We've got one from down in Florida coming up. So stay tuned to that. And then also the Skim 8 podcast at skim8.com.
And I will be live tomorrow, 12 o'clock Central Time on Facebook from a midday Monday question and answer session. Thanks, Terence, for reminding me about what's coming up before next Sunday. So with that, everyone, have a great night. Thanks for being here. Stay safe. Wash your hands. We'll get through this craziness, and we'll catch you later.